making us all feel welcome in your house. This is our house. Very, very fine house. And Carl, I mean, so I'm stuttering now. I suddenly have a stutter. Carl is, of course, one of my heroes. Both for all, I wouldn't. Were it not for all the President's Men, there would be no A.M. Homes. I mean, no, but seriously. I mean, we'll talk about that. But that your work and those hearings and all of that dovetailed with my kind of adolescence and moral coming of age. And so there's no way I would ever have written much of what I've written had you not done all the things you did and took the risks that you took. So it's a super treat, and we also have other things in common we'll talk about. But I thought what we would do is I'll start by reading a little bit, and I'm going to maybe keep it. I was going to read two things. I may just read the one thing because I know there's a lot we want to talk about, and I know you guys have a lot of questions for Carl. So I'm going to jump in, and so I'll tell you the tiniest bit about. I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning of the unfolding, and it does start on election night 2008, which some of you remember. I remember I was in New York City. I got a new TV. I upgraded from my college TV because I was having friends over. And then where I live on Washington Square, when the results came in, there was this enormous sense of excitement and fireworks, and people went out in the street and were celebrating. And then I realized, oh, there's also another version of this, and I wanted to kind of begin to look at that. So this scene that I'm going to read takes place in the Biltmore Hotel in Phoenix, Arizona, which is where John McCain was the night. And remember when presidents used to, or candidates would concede, right? That was a thing too. And I was like, yeah. So anyway, that happened. But I'm going to read a little bit from that, and then I'll just tell you there's three sort of main characters in this part of the book. And it's a book that's two stories. One is the story of this family, which is a guy named the Big Guy, who is not Donald Trump. He is just the big guy, which we all know who those big guys are. And his wife, Charlotte, who is an alcoholic. If you imagine Joan Didion and Nancy Reagan and Pat Nixon kind of melded. She is the social X-ray who prefers vodka. And then their daughter Megan, who more about this happens in the book later, who votes for the first time that year. And I wanted to really also look at what does it mean to kind of come of age in the way that you begin to realize, oh, maybe you don't see the world the same way that your family does, which we all have iterations of. And then there's this larger story about these forever men in it, but I'm just going to jump into this bit. Okay, so this is election night, Biltmore Hotel. Her father has a schedule of parties. It's like trick-or-treating. You go from party to party, and as they progress, the snacks get fancier, the crowds get smaller, the rooms get nicer, and flower arrangements multiply. At every stop, her mother heads for the bar. Vodka with soda on the rocks. Her mother takes a piece of celery from her crudité sculpture. Have this. It'll keep you occupied and away from the penis nuts, Megan says. Her mother smiles. Penis nuts. That's what her mother calls the communal bowls of nuts. There are things that one teaches a young girl. Never eat the penis nuts. Men don't wash their hands. If you must eat something, take something that's sticking straight up. Celery, a cheese stick, a carrot. But God forbid, don't dip it into anything. That's the other weak spot. The double dippers. The McCains are here, someone says. At the party? No, upstairs. He's arrived here at the hotel. I still feel sorry for Cindy, one of the women says. It's hard to be the wife. Jewel of the desert, Megan hears her father say. This is the same hotel where John and Cindy got married, May 17th, 1980. It's their happy place. I already lost it. God willing, someone says. An old man starts choking on a pig and blanket, and the room falls silent except for the televisions. Just as someone gets behind him and is about to do the big squeeze, the man coughs it up on his own. Well, we all know where this is heading, someone else says. It's like watching an accident. Are you sure? They're all looking at the televisions. Yes, something is wrong, very wrong. Well, a lot of things are wrong. It's on us, someone says. We took our eye off the ball. It's her. He never should have picked her. She's an idiot. Well, do you think he talked to her before he picked her? Well, if he didn't, he's an idiot. Well, somebody talked to her, but maybe they forgot to ask important questions like, do you own your own clothing? Or what's the view from your kitchen window? Well, I can see Russia from here, someone says. Do you remember when Cindy had the drug problem? She handled it so gracefully. I hear John's a gambler. Well, he's a superstitious man, that's for sure. My friend knew him in the Navy and said he had a lucky charm he carried with him, a rock. Oh, it was a feather, someone says. He keeps a feather. The staff went mental when he lost it. Really? He lost his lucky feather? Did they find it? I have no idea. And a crowd of Secret Service agents sweeps into the room, and just their physical volume pushes the crowd back against the wall. John and Cindy enter, and the crowd breaks into applause. I'm so glad to see you all, John McCain says. Cindy and I just want to stop by and thank you for the work you've done to make this campaign a strong one and for sticking with me through the unexpected ups and downs of the last few months. There's a brief pause. How's it looking? Someone shouts. McCain shakes his head. Well, right now I wouldn't want to be me. He chuckles painfully. Someone is hissing, low like a rattlesnake. The hissing builds. It's more than one person. Megan is shocked. The hissing is overpowered by booing, and she can't tell if they're booing McCain or booing the people hissing. Don't be a loser, the man next to her shouts loudly. His wife smacks him hard. Shut up, you're drunk. We love you, someone shouts. Don't quit now. And with nothing left to say, John McCain raises his arm as far as he can and makes a gesture somewhere between a salute and a send-off. And quickly they're out of the room, enveloped by the Secret Service. Well, hopefully no one will remember you, the wife of the drunk man says. Oh, please, I'm the least of his problems. I'm surprised he could come in here and seem normal enough. Well, what should he do? Start crying? He's got to put a good face on it. Who knows what he's doing upstairs? Smashing shit, that's what I'd be doing, the man says. I'd be throwing the sofa through the window. That's it, the wife says. I warned you. We're leaving now. Say nighty-night to your friends. And that's just a little stupid.
Start by saying thanks for having us here tonight. And I was hoping you would start with the line that you didn't. And
which one is that?
this can't happen here. That's the first words of this remarkable book. And those words are the parameters of the book.
They're coming to fondle with your microphone.
Yes.
Oh, let's fondle with my mic? Go right ahead. Just tell me what to do.
Just put that on.
Put that on.
Can you guys hear better now? Is that a little...
Rock and roll.
And Jimi Hendrix is back! That would be fun, Carl. We could do that. We could do a rock and roll night. Karaoke with Carl and Amy.
Now I'll do what I get to do and brag at moments like that. My younger son is Taylor Swift's guitar player.
No way!
This is really the best brag a dad gets to do.
Actually, she's brilliant. I do think she's truly
She
brilliant.
is.
And also as a...
And in fact, maybe that's what we'll talk about tonight. So, but really,
Congratulations, Carl.
this can't happen here. The brilliance of this book, which is at once history, memoir, I'm going to take the liberty of saying,
You can do that.
and this can't happen here now. It happened in our childhoods, which are reflected in this book. As was said earlier, we both grew up in D.C., as you did. She went to Holy Cross High. You went to BCC. I went to rival Montgomery Blair. We all cut down the pine tree, and we never got over it. But this book is informed by Washington, D.C. and what happened here. And it opens with the big guy, as you call him, realizing that a black man has been elected the President of the United States of America. And then this amazing narrative starts to go off in all these directions. So I want to ask you, how is it that you managed to come up with both a structure, a narrative that brings together a history? You know, you cite the people around Eisenhower who were going to take over if the Russians attacked and the leadership were knocked out. The sweep of this book goes from there. So it's also about the Cold War, how we got to this place, and I'll give a personal note here that I think may help inform our discussion. Because we get to Trump.
Right.
The
Without
book-
getting to Trump,
The,
yes.
the book also takes us to Trump in a way that almost no other book has, without him being there. What I've written and what I believe is that we've had a cold civil war in this country for close to 40 years. Trump ignited the cold civil war. And that's where we are. And what you have done is told the story of the ignition, because the ignition was made possible because this is not about Donald Trump. This is about the United States and its people and its citizens. And the characters in here are the instruments of ignition. So I want to ask you, how did you structurally, narratively, personally, and sitting down at what we used to call a typewriter, come up with this work of genius?
First I thought, what will Carl Bernstein do? Thank you. I mean, that's big. I think a couple things. One is that I am and was and increasingly have become a history buff. And I think history is incredibly important. Because I don't forget that sometimes. And I also wanted to talk about sort of both the large scale of how we got from like sort of the end of World War II to this moment, because I think that somehow people think that it was just Trump arrived and all of a sudden everything went south. And when I started this book, Trump wasn't even actually on the horizon, which is the really scary thing. And I said to my editors, like, I feel like there's something happening out there. And what that was that I thought was happening was that the political establishment, both sides, all sides, had lost touch with the American people. And that political fundraising had started to become a much bigger thing. So what was $10,000 and $100,000 in 2008, 2009 is millions and billions of dollars now. And that's like Leonard Leo and all that stuff. And so that rise of dark money was a big piece of it, right? And that becomes complicated. And I felt that there was nobody listening to people anymore, you know? So that thread was there. And then I wanted to talk about this family and the idea that this father who believes that he's a good person, he needs to believe that about himself. And yet his family is a mess, and as his family kind of comes apart, what's interesting is they get to know each other better, and they're actually sort of stronger at the end, even if they don't know it quite yet. So I don't know, and the editor said to me, you don't write science fiction. And I said, I know, but there's something happening out there. And then they were kind of like not interested. And then right when Trump was elected, they called, like, where is it? And I was like, well, you weren't interested, you know? So there'll be a delay. And then luckily, because as you know, it forecasts kind of January 6th, and I had wanted it to come out before the last presidential election. And publishing takes, as you know, like a year and a half. And so it didn't come out, as I would say, in time. And when January 6th happened, then all these other people called and go like, oh my God, did you do that? And I'm like, no, I did not do that. You know, but they said, well, you would have been in really like trouble had the book been out. So
why and how did you, and this is part of the power of the book, because it's not a conventional narrative.
No.
It's written for the most part in dialogue. I would say, I don't know, 60, 70, 80% is scenic dialogue without explication. Right. What does that do, and how did you get to it? Why did you do that?
I know. The funny thing is I didn't know that I did that. The editor called and like, where's the narration? I'm like, what narration? I think, you know, my background a little bit also is theater and playwriting. And so for me, it's like Edward Albee and Harold Pinter. And I wanted to give the guys in this book and the other characters just room to live and to be themselves. And I didn't think it needed a lot of description, because they had things they needed to talk about, and they are characters.
Well, you also always write for the year.
I do,
And,
yeah.
I mean, I
love
try, but it makes this book stand out because instead of conventional narration, we're really inside the heads of these characters who are trying to find out how to express their own frustration, hates,
Right.
fears. And why did you think you wanted the mother to be an alcoholic?
Oh, no. Well, first about the guys, I also wanted to sort of try to capture, and it's funny because obviously I'm not a guy, but the experience in a way, the bravado that guys, when they're sort of by themselves, the way they kind of up the ante, like, well, I did blah, 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 or, and there is that kind of both sort of blustery, sort of masculinity that they're like, I can blah, blah, do this. And so there's that piece of it. I wanted Charlotte to be an alcoholic. No, I didn't want her to be an alcoholic. She is an alcoholic. Because she's also an interesting point. She is of a generation still where basically women didn't have a chance to live their life. So for her, it wasn't going to be, what are you going to be when you grow up? It's like, what kind of man are you going to marry? So her life has been on hold and sort of in service to her husband, and she's also the keeper of secrets in the family. And so I felt like, in that way, that Betty Ford and Pat Nixon, and there is this history of sort of the political wife, even though she's not actually a political wife, of women who didn't yet get a chance. So she's still evolving, I think.
I love the McCain stuff. I spent 6 months with McCain in 1999 when he was trying to win the nomination. And what I take away at the beginning of the book is, in part, that there was a Republican conscience.
Yes.
And in what you read a moment ago about his reaction coming in, and the time that I spent with him, and became kind of close.
Right, sure.
To him during those 6 months. And was sent Cindy, and stayed up there in Arizona with him for a while.
We'll hear, of course, more about all of that.
But where do you end up in this book? What do you think you're saying at the end about the country and where we are today? Because it reads ambiguous to me.
Right.
And
I think it should be. I mean, it is ambiguous in the sense that I don't ever, when I'm writing a novel or not, whatever I'm writing, I don't have sort of the sense that I want you to think this or believe that. What I'm really doing is hoping to prompt a discussion and to raise questions and sort of say, what do you think? Or where does this land with you? And with this book, it was interesting because right before it came out, a bookseller said to me, well, who is this for? And I was like, uh-oh. And I thought, what is that question? Because I wasn't sure if the bookseller meant, is this for people on the left or people on the right? Is this for men or women? Because there's that whole thing too that, like, men don't buy books by women or read books by women. Men don't write fiction. And then they're like, people on the right don't read books. People on the left don't want to read about these people. And I was just like, okay. So I think for me, I really wanted to talk about, and the big guy for me absolutely is a Republican with conscience. And that may be something that's leaving very quickly now, right? And that is also of a generation. And I thought I wanted to look at that and what does it mean to be a young person voting for the first time? And the idea that at its best, the big guy thinks, my daughter, he realizes it's okay he doesn't have a son, but he's got this daughter and she's gonna be just like him. And that's still this like big guy, like bravado. It's like he doesn't see past his own, So I wanted it up in the air. A lot more could happen.
I should add, it is wildly funny. This book. It is, it's incredible. It's biting, but there is true hilarity in it.
You have to be funny if you're going to be so serious, because otherwise no, I think that if you're funny, it cuts through and people can then laugh and it breaks the surface tension and you can talk about really intense, horrible things.
But also, this family has a funny predicament in its horror.
Yes.
And so what you're getting is the horror, the irony, and how these three people are trying to address what's going on in their deepest lives. And we're watching what's going on in the country over a 40-year period. So that's going to be how I'm going to frame this discussion.
Yeah, and I think there's a thing too, like when the big guy also begins to realize, because he thinks he's a good guy. He's like, I give a lot of money away, I do all kinds of things to take care of people, I'm a good guy. And then when he begins to realize that he might be an asshole, that's sort of like unbearable to him. And he's like, oh my God, what is that? And then there's, to me, a moment that I think is my personal funniest part, where he's like at the National Zoo with his daughter, they're having what they're hoping is like sort of a bonding moment. He's like, is there anything you wish you'd done or invented that, you didn't do? And he's like, yeah, there is something. And she's like, what is it? And you're expecting, he's like, I wish I'd invented the atomic bomb. And I'm like, oh my God. Again, the hubris, like that would be the thing. Like that's proof of the big guy, Who thinks like that?
Let's talk about what informs this book through its author. Which is to say, you grew up in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
So, how does Washington become the character in this book? Even though the book is not really set in Washington, it is of Washington, by Washington, and about Washington.
Yeah. And I want also to ask you the same question, of course. I'll answer it, and then we have to ask Carl some questions. I think that growing up in Washington, and I'm so curious what your experience was. So I grew up in a Jewish leftist family that we couldn't have iceberg lettuce because it wasn't union. You couldn't have grapes because they weren't union. You couldn't go on vacation because it wasn't union. And I lived in a neighborhood that, Teddy Lerner, who on the Nationals lived in. Everyone has become like a gabillionaire. My mother, who's 97, is still there, not eating the things that are not union, in their glass modern house. So it was a very strange thing to grow up on the one hand in this sort of place that became increasingly wealthy, and also with my parents saying, very concerned about the racial issues and the racial tension in DC. And, marching, that was what we did. We marched. I was like, what are we doing this weekend? We're marching. And all that stuff. And I think there was always that sense, too, of the surrealism of DC. So we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but as a kid, you'd go to Woody's to go buy a pair of shoes, and the Nixon girls would be in there with Secret Service agents. And you can't come in here now. Or try to go home for dinner, and they'd say, your road is closed. And you're like, why? The president is having dinner. I'm like, well, Mom wants me home too. And then, we're talking about Hubert Humphrey, when he was vice president, used to drive past us on the way to school in the morning, because there was no vice presidential residence. So Washington, when I was a kid, was still, when you were a small town, it was a small southern town that was very complex. And it didn't occur to me that it was anything more than a small southern town until I was at summer camp in North Carolina at a Christian camp, which is a little odd for a Jewish camp. And there were prayers 3 times a day, and I actually really loved church, full on. I remember this sailor midi, and I also couldn't get it off because I was chubby, and so I had to get kids to help me undress, and say, get me out of here. It was like a straitjacket while praying. And Nixon resigned, and one of my counselors, Farnell Cowan, said, I bet Mama's having a heart attack. And I remember thinking, I bet there's a party in Georgetown. And I thought, I'm not in the right camp, literally. And the idea all of a sudden was, I was aware that Washington that I had grown up in was something else to the whole rest of the country. And I didn't know that until I was outside of it. And then you realize, oh my God, people think Washington runs the country. Uh-oh.
I'm going to come back to this can't happen here,
Yeah,
because this is about race.
yes.
And so I'm going to, in my own instance, my parents were radicals, left-wing radicals, who were of that first generation that integrated Jim Crow, Washington, D.C. I went to public schools in the capital of the United States of America that were legally segregated until May 17th, 1954. I think that's the most important date in many ways in my life.
Yeah, and talk about also because it wasn't, because DC, right,
in the life
wasn't a
of,
state.
in the life of the country, and gets us to this can't happen here.
Yeah,
Because not only was DC that I grew up in, and I'm a generation older, I'm almost 20 years older than they am, a Jim Crow town that black people couldn't eat in restaurants downtown, only in government-owned cafeterias, or they had to stand at lunch counters. And so when I was 8 with my parents, I was on those first lunch counter sit-downs,
Right.
we called them then. And, you know, there are two decisions on May 17, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, which applies to the 50 states. Well, it was then 48 states. And Bowling versus Sharp, because Brown did not include the District of Columbia because it's not a state. And the companion case, both opinions written by Chief Justice Warren, unanimous decision of the Supreme Court of the United States. Bowling versus Sharp was about the DC school system. And there was, when I went to school, and I'm a second generation native of DC, when my mother went to school, we both were pupils in the white division of the DC school system, as opposed to the Negro division, until May the 17th, 1954. And so, your book, your life, I think, my life was this kind of pall that defined where we grew up and the environment. You know, my book is a memoir of going to work at age 16 at a great Washington newspaper, the Evening Star, not the Post. But from age 16 to 21, I had the greatest seat in the country. This kid, just, you know, and able, you know, I went to work there in the last few weeks of the Kennedy-Nixon campaign. And within a few weeks of arriving, was assigned of all things to cover the crowd at the Kennedy rally at my high school. And so it's a kind of rollicking tale, this book of this kid that, and of course, no way was I going to, like you, I was barely able to get out of high school and never was able to finish college. But the most important, while all this wild stuff is going on in this rollicking memoir of this kid, including going to Elkton, Maryland, where it's the one place you could get married outside of Las Vegas without a waiting period. When I was 18, I went with the girl I was in love with at the paper. We went in the middle of the night to go get married in Elkton. And a little subplot there. But what happens, the most important line, you know, Woodward and I, 50 years ago, was All the President's Men, and we wrote a new introduction to the book last year that really is about Donald Trump. And this can't happen here.
right.
And so we keep coming back to this can't happen here, and how writers, journalists, etc., affect and are enveloped by this notion of this can't happen here. Because Woodward and I started saying during Watergate, people were saying, well,